fiction. Science fiction. We make no guarantees, however, how long it will remain fiction. Fiction. Fiction.
Sacrificial salutations to all you cognonauts out there, and welcome to another episode of Exofathom. I am Nick, and I am joined, as always, by my two lovely co-hosts. Ayla, how are you? Ayla's got her microphone on mute, and so does Mike. Both of you guys are on mute. I don't know why.
Oh, goodness. So sorry. I am all thumbs today. I heard Mercury retrograde is coming, and I was like, that's not a thing. And then after today, I'm like, oh, it's a thing.
Oh, it's a thing for sure. I think it was StreamYard side because I think it just failed to unmute you guys once the intro music started. So we got Mike here. How's it going, man? You're on mute. Oh, now you're on mute. Good.
I don't want to talk.
Okay.
I'm hanging in there.
Awesome.
It's Monday. How's your Monday going?
Not too bad. Can't complain in the least bit. Do work and living life and just trying to make sense of all this craziness in the world. So doing this episode will probably be a little bit of reprieve, although I definitely went a little overboard in my research. At one point, I had about 30 tabs open on my computer. So
you sacrificed yourself to the gods of human sacrifice.
There you go. That's what I did. I sacrificed my time to human sacrifice. So.
Hey.
And for those of you who are tuning in with us this evening, that is exactly what we're going to be discussing. I wanted to get into this conversation kind of surrounding the concept of human sacrifice because it's something that I think of casually sometimes, and I'm like, wow, we used to do that. And I've thought about it enough times in the recent past to think, okay, maybe I need to look more into it. And we wanted to do this episode and just kind of present some information. Off the bat, it's going to be kind of structured about the ancient sort of origins of ritual human sacrifice, connections obviously to religion, contemporary examples of human sacrifice, when we stopped and why, and just some psychology around the concepts of human sacrifice as well. So hope that you guys enjoy this episode. Buckle up, grab a drink, maybe some popcorn or something like that, and we can just jump right into it. Ayla, Mike, what would you do for a Klondike bar?
Sacrifice a human.
Absolutely.
That's the correct answer.
Just throw them off a cliff into a big vat of Klondike bars.
Into a volcano, clearly. And then you surf the Klondike bars to safety.
Refreshing. Yeah, definitely.
But now here's the question. When's the last time you had a Klondike bar?
I'll answer that. It's been at least 20 years, and it wasn't that good. It's just vanilla ice cream with some chocolate over it.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah, I would say bonbons are a much better chocolate to vanilla ratio than the Klondike bar. It's too much vanilla.
Yeah, way too much vanilla, and not as good as the classic ice cream sandwich. So
yeah,
I'm a drumstick kind of person.
Drumsticks are good. I'm
okay,
not hating on the drumstick.
Do you hate or love the end of the drumstick, which is just waffle cone with like
That's
a chunk of chocolate?
Part.
It's too dry. Really?
What?
No, because the ice cream melts down to that point, and then you have like ice cream, chocolate, and waffle cone all in one bite. It's very nice.
No, alas.
Nah.
Or you chop off the top of the drumstick and put it on a bowl, and you can dip it.
Oh, that's a good guy. That's a good plan. Good plan.
There you go. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is a very silly question I asked right off the top of the bat, but it is something that I was thinking about, and more so, I'm interested in this sort of like psychological mechanism of what sacrifice is, and so for some reason, it just popped up in my head when I was looking into all of this stuff as a sort of funny, tongue-in-cheek example of the concept of sacrifice, and it's as old as humans are old, and it's been something that we've been a lot more brutal about in the past, but since have changed our methods in exhibiting that sort of, I don't know what you would call it, an innate human characteristic. What would you guys call it? That need, because I'm trying my best to define it, but it's the same thing as, like, what would you do for a Klondike bar? And the answer is, sacrifice a human. There's something there that I think is kind of deep rooted in humans.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go for it.
Oh, well, I was going to be real quick. I was just thinking that to me, oftentimes when I think of human sacrifice and the instances I heard about it, it was always a means to an end. So there was some sort of a reward that comes by sacrificing a person. You're paying homage to gods, or you're, welcoming a good harvest, or something like that. And so, yeah, with the Klondike bar analogy, makes sense, like what would you do for blank? And it gets to the heart of, okay, you work hard for a paycheck to get food, what if you add one more thing? What if you add one more thing? And then it's like, would you do this to do that? And then maybe that's where maybe you're going with it in terms of like.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think it's definitely It's definitely touching off of that sort of payoff reward mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also think that it like fulfills a need of ritual. Like I think humans are innately bloodlusty, like inherently violent type creatures, and inherently spiritual. I mean, before we had science, we had faith in gods, and you way back, right? And you have cave paintings of gods and stuff like that. So I think maybe it fulfills that sort of like ritual bloodlust need, and it allows people to like structureize taking somebody else's life in service of like a higher faith principle.
Instead of just the need to destroy somebody.
Yeah, like it allows you to rationalize it, right? You're not just destroying somebody or destroying the enemy. It's more ritualistic, more ceremonialized, more sacred, I guess, than just destroying somebody.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point, because it does seem very arbitrary, right? The reasons seem quite arbitrary. Now, maybe they weren't so much to ancient humans, which, may be true. I obviously truly believe that if they sacrificed a virgin, they were going to get a good harvest. Maybe the lack of pattern recognition also plays a little bit into that. But it is interesting that I would tend to agree with you that we probably did tie ourselves into knots to justify some sort of deep-seated violence that we have as humans.
And on top of that, right, like if you sacrificed one virgin, you had a bad harvest. The next year you had to sacrifice two or something, right? Like obviously this wasn't good enough for the gods. And you see that a little bit too with like prophecy readings. Whenever like someone misread a prophecy, it's not that the prophecy itself is wrong or that there's something going strange there. It's the interpreter's ability to read the actual prophecy.
Right. Confirmation bias of sorts, where it's like you already have your idea set on the outcome, so you just have to figure out how to get there.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can't, and if it doesn't work, then obviously you did something wrong.
Which is such an intense sort of mind trap or cyclical thing, because it feeds itself. And I think that's a really great sort of response and definitely apt. Ayla, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that part?
No, I mean, I think that's a good, point to bring up. We don't know the mechanisms by which events arise, and so we're led to interpret and infer. And so, a series of negative events could be described as working off one's karmic debt. It could also be seen as, maybe just bad luck. And then people take steps to remedy that. But again, it's like intrinsically, we still don't actually know why bad things happen, if they're earned or deserved, if there's multiple realities and lives that are, doing said earning, and whether or not there's a sense of divine justice after we die. So there's a lot to be said for what we don't know and the different ways that we try to make ourselves feel better.
Mm. And yeah, I definitely see that. And kind of makes me want to bring up this question to you guys too. And maybe this is a bit premature, but I think it's a decent question to kind of start off with. I- i- is that the ultimate? Is human sacrifice the ultimate sacrifice? So to say that if there's something that you desire so much that you're willing to give up human life for it, like is that the penultimate? Do we get any further than that as humans, or is that just kind of like innately hardwired into our understanding, like the most the most impactful sacrifice is always a human one?
See, this is where it gets tricky. I think about this sometimes when I watch like comic book movies, and you have like one hero constantly sacrificing their life for, you know, people. Um, it's a little bit different because they have the superpowers and the other people don't. But then think about it like when somebody does a good deed, sometimes you help somebody because of just wanting to be a good person. Other times you're doing it to get sort of like a point reward on the justice scale of things. And so if you're doing it for some sort of a reward, it seems somehow less pure. So where am I going with this human sacrifice? I would say it kind of is the ultimate thing, but at the same time,
I think you're saying it's like if it's more ultimate if it was a selfless act.
yeah, exactly. Like, somebody being chucked into a volcano. I don't know why I'm thinking of Joe and the volcano. You know that Tom Hanks
Yeah.
movie? That's where I'm going. So it's like, yeah, you could be against your will tossed in a volcano, or you could plunge into the volcano knowing you're going to save a bunch of people. And I think that there's a difference in those two.
Mm.
And then I wonder if you inspect that, if you will find other parallels without the sacrificing that might somehow surpass it. But that's my knee jerk thought right there.
Yeah, and I think you're probably correct about the like the difference between a magnanimous sacrifice or a selfless sacrifice and one to serve an end goal. But I think what's interesting, and we can touch on this a little bit later too. Most people that were ever sacrificed thought that was the right thing to do, and they were active in it because they thought they were doing the right thing by sacrificing themselves for their people.
Yeah, look at the Dark Knight, right? The end of the Dark Knight, Batman sacrifices himself to save Harvey Dent. And Batman has no superpowers except for being rich, right?
Right.
He sacrifices his reputation, all that stuff, to be the hero Gotham deserves or whatever. But then that sacrifice it plays out badly in Dark Knight Returns. What's the one with Rises? Yeah, with Bane. Ends up being bad because the whole truth about Harvey Dent comes out. Blah blah blah. But in that moment, that self-sacrifice is more important for that short time frame, right? So maybe it's good in the short term, but bad in the long term.
Yeah,
I think penultimately though, it like as long as the human you're sacrificing is yourself, then that's the penultimate sacrifice thing. The second you start sacrificing other humans for your own thing, whether it be good or bad, whether your end point is to have a peaceful world, so we have to kill all the unpeaceful people. That's where it gets really dark really fast.
yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important distinction. The concept of self-sacrifice would be something that was seen as heroic, and to kind of mention what Abel was talking about with the Marvel movies and stuff like that. But you're right. The moment that you decide that it's the sacrifice has to be made, but you're not going to be the one that making it, that's when things devolve into madness.
Yeah, exactly. And there's countless historical situations where that has gone down, right? Where it's been somebody deciding which group of people need to be sacrificed for the greater good.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, and since we don't necessarily do human sacrifice, and we're going to get into the history very shortly, but I wanted to ask you guys one more question before we start. Since obviously we're not ritualistically killing people, at least in
Speak
overt
for
ways.
yourself. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, at least in overt ways. I was thinking about this concept, and Ayla, you've already kind of like mentioned it a little bit, but do you guys think of any sort of modern facsimiles to human sacrifice today? Like, does anything come off the top of your head when you think about the same sort of, I don't know, psychological mechanism, not the literal act?
Yeah, the 9 to 5 and long commutes.
Oh, get them.
I always thought this. This is why I exited the strict 9 to 5 going to an office thing years ago, pre-pandemic, mind you. I did it before all you guys did it. Hipster over here.
Such a hipster.
Yeah. What was I saying? But yeah, no, it just seemed to me like, that's your time, that's your life. And to spend it, I just remember when I did have 9 to 5s, sitting in the car for an hour and a half, sometimes miserable, doing nothing to accelerate my own goals. You can listen to music, you could do books on tape and stuff. You could learn a language, I suppose. But you're still occupied on the whim of some other group or entity. And then you're there for 8 hours, and then you come back for another 2 hours. And then you do that for decades on end, and then you supposedly get your life back. But, yeah. So I think to me, like, that kind of seems like a sort of sacrifice, that we've bought
But
into.
hey, you get a paycheck though. Isn't
That you
isn't that
do.
worth your life?
And
Isn't
yes,
that-
and,
That was worth your life. Yeah.
and when I did have the 9 to 5s, my paycheck was not enough to justify the loss of livelihood that I was having.
Well, and I think that's an important distinction, right? So like then you have to sort of like to get out of that loop, you have to imagine a life in which you would be happy to spend all of that sort of time debt, right?
Yeah, and I think that like I think it depends on the person, like certain situations are harder to cope with for different people. I think, everyone kind of has, like some folks would be more than happy clocking in, clocking out, because it's kind of like just chill, and then they go home and they have their full fulfilled life or whatnot. But I also think that like the is it Alanis Morissette, that ironic song
Yeah.
wormed its way into my head, because it's like that guy that worked his whole damn life for a pension, and then like the day he got retired, he like dies.
No,
So
I won
that's
the lottery and died the next day.
Oh, that's what it was.
I know this song with meticulous autism because it bothers me so much because there's no irony in that song.
Which is ironic. That's the great nest
Ah,
egg. It's
You
beautiful.
can't tell me that she was being meta with that. No
She
way.
was. No, she totally was. 100%. Yeah. And yeah, but anyway, I think so that's the thing, is that like again with that scenario, you're banking on being alive down the road,
Mhm.
and it's like for me, I've had so many near death experiences. It's like there's no guarantee. So I'm just gonna try to live my life as I can. So that's the first facsimile that comes to
Yeah,
mind.
I think that's a really good example. If I can ask just to follow up, then we'll get Mike's answer. Is what do you
Uh-oh.
think? Well, what do you think that sacrifice is for? The 9 to 5.
Oh, I mean, it's for dwelling, for shelter, food, protection. I could have just as easily moved to a forest and hunted fish and built a cabin. But the level of effort
Just
and
as
skills
easily?
required. Well, I mean, you think about it, how many hours? That's like 9 hours. If I like sit
It's
on
so funny. It's like,
YouTube.
oh yeah, I go to the office 8 hours a day. I could pretty much homestead.
Okay,
Just
well, you have
imagining
to.
Ayla running down the side of a river with like spears and like chucking them at fishes.
Oh my god. Well, see, the thing is that like it's not that far off, because I like have res connections. Like I know how to butcher a sheep. I know how to tend livestock. I know how to grow food. I've fixed roofs before. I've laid foundation. Like it's not that hard, and it's especially not that hard if you're not doing it for someone else. Like if it's just me, yeah, I can build a crappy house. As long as I'm in a dwelling, I'm good. So that's the thing, but that's the trade-off, is that I would be in a crappy mud hut. and particularly don't want to live, with a dirt floor. I'd like tile or something. Well, not anymore. I'd like carpet, but
So I guess the sacrifice is comfort.
yes, in that situation. But it goes back and forth. There's lots of other alternative routes that folks could take. That's why I mean, like, again, for some people, the trade-off is perfect because even that commute is comfortable. They get a really nice car. They learn a skill while they're doing it. And then that's when they say, like, what is it? Get a job that you love, or what's that? If you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. That's where that adage comes from, is that if you cringe at the idea of doing a 9 to 5, then you want to gravitate towards something that at least gives you some feedback on your, like, goals, or your there's a term I'm missing here, like, something that's semi-fulfilling or ultimately fulfilling, so I think that's kind of all I got to say on that.
Yeah, I think that you're onto something there. Although I would push back against that adage of if you love something, you'll never work a day in your life. Honestly, I've been fed up on things I loved before. So I mean, it's like I'm sure the person that's doing their dream job sometimes wakes up and is like, do I really have to today?
Oh, yeah.
Nightmares are dreams too.
That's right.
That's true. Nice, Mike. But that's a really good point too, is that, like, I remember thinking I would really love a job. I'm not going to get into the particulars, but job A. And it was really complicated, and there's some prestige, and it was really great. And I hated it. And then I got, like, a different job, which was just, like, reception for, like, a couple months. And I loved it. I could do reception all day. The pressure is very low. You're just, like, chit-chatting with people all day. Everything you delegate to somebody else. Like, it just was so chill. You could, like, surf the internet. And people do that, and they're totally fine. So I think that's what I mean, is, like, because then eventually for me, I got bored. But some people don't get bored. Like, it just depends.
Yeah. Mike, what about you? Any sort of modern day facsimile to human sacrifice?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. Where do you want to start?
Whichever one pops up to you first, really.
I guess I like the 9 to 5 thing because I've always saw jobs sort of being like that, unless there's some intrinsic value you get out of the work, right? But you're still sacrificing yourself for somebody else's dreams or time or profit or whatever you want to call it. And then you can operate in that area in different ways too, right? Like because if I just vanish, if I just went off into the woods somewhere, I would still be doing the same work. Like I love software engineering, so that's just going to be a thing that happens all the time. Still really don't consider it work that much, outside of, I guess, some knowledge problems. But you can use your utility to lessen the sacrifice of others, right? If you're the one who takes on all the overtime, who takes on all the work, then other people don't have to do that. Other people can go home and be more present in other components of their life, which otherwise they would have to stay for overtime, right? They would have to do more work instead of taking that commute back home and hopefully learning how to drive, because a lot of people in LA need to learn how to drive while they're driving. Fantastic if they did that.
That's very true.
But I mean, there's other ones too, right? Like if you serve a country or anything like that, you can almost look at that as a huge sacrifice, especially because of how little control you have over your situation that you end up in. Your base, whatever orders come down above you, you have to follow those. And sometimes it means marching into a volcano. Right? Then you can think about if you open yourself up to things like medical experiments, if you're any sort of experimentation, psychological, medical, anything within those sectors, then you're sacrificing yourself for somebody else's. But maybe outside of serving a country, the big missing factor is that there's somebody else forcing you to do that sacrifice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like at a 9 to 5, you can always quit. You can always just walk off the job and say this is dumb.
Right.
With the maybe with the medical experiments, you could just not be a part of that situation. And I guess too in the military, you go AWOL, but we miss that that compulsive component of human sacrifice that seemed to be so much there in the ancient times, right? Where if you tried to escape, you could try to escape, but if they found you, you were still being sacrificed. Whereas if I quit a job and I just walk off, it's not like they're going to come hunt me down and be like, you gotta finish this job.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I could definitely see that for sure. Yeah, it is interesting, the concept of compulsion, and it does seem like, we've naturally steered ourselves towards voluntary sacrifice instead of compulsory sacrifice, and we'll get a little bit into that in a little bit, but I guess I should just start getting into some of the history and a little bit of examples of human sacrifice. I have a couple examples that I want to kind of highlight, and but first, yes,
one more example I just thought of.
Yeah.
Like the protesters that will chain themselves to like a tree that's about to get bulldozed.
Yeah.
I mean, like they're putting their life on the line, knowing that it could go bad. So it's like a risk of sacrifice. But even still, like their personhood could still be harmed or imprisoned. And again, that is to like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that just came to mind to keep in mind as we look through like some of the older notions and to see how that would work in, because it's like a voluntary sacrifice.
No, it definitely seems to me as a sort of magic system. I don't know if I can put my finger on it exactly, but it does seem like the cost being human life reaps the greatest reward.
I think it's something we can all understand, right? Like if you see somebody standing in front of a tank or tied to a tree, the message is very clear as what's happening, right? You just can't deny what's going on. So maybe then life, we find it so precious to ourselves, right? It's such something that that we value to the point if you run into somebody that doesn't, you might think they are off their rocker, right? So and it's very clear without any sort of verbal communication or anything like that, where that seems to be where that magic lies in, is that you don't need words to communicate it, and it holds the one thing that we hold above all else, which is our own lives.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's just dive into some of the early stuff about human sacrifice. So I was looking and doing lots of research, and I was trying to pin down like a first instance, like maybe archaeologists know, like the first confirmed case of human sacrifice. And really, it's not exactly that cut and dry. Obviously, humans have been around for a very long time. So any sort of archaeological evidence of human sacrifice would have to be overwhelming for them to conclude that that's what it was, and not just some sort of burial mound. And of course, if you don't have any further context to a burial site, you don't assume that it's human sacrifice. But what I could find was that they have definitely pinpointed it to the Neolithic era. And interestingly, actually, I think that and we can talk about this shortly, is during around 10,000 BC, across Eurasia and North Africa, basically humans stopped becoming nomadic, or stopped being nomadic, and started to plant roots. And so that's marked, the Neolithic era is sort of marked by this concept that humans stopped being nomadic. They started to settle down in places, and then almost instantly religion sprang up. And with the springing of religion came hierarchies within village systems. And with those hierarchies in village systems came human sacrifice. And so the closest I could get was around 10,000 BC. They have dug up graves of, I believe there were 3 children that they are certain had to have been human sacrifices, because the bodies were placed deliberately in the grave in a way that couldn't have been natural. And so archaeologists kind of state this as the first instance of human sacrifice, at least that they can find. And this happened in Eurasia during the Neolithic era, around 10,000 years ago. But I do think it's really interesting that once we started to settle down and plant roots and sort of make villages is exactly when religion became important in our cultures. And I'm wondering if what you guys think about that, because that was something that I never really sort of put together, but human sacrifice and religion are almost born at the same moment.
Yes.
Yes.
No,
I don't know if I just never really considered that before, but I thought it was really interesting that that basically as soon as we just stopped being nomadic, like that's when we just started to come up with religions.
And then just started sacrificing people.
And then just started sacrificing people to these
this
gods.
production line of sacrifices going. We have to, yeah. And I think,
That's
I mean, because moving from nomadic life, you know, you become one step civilized, but I think it's that bloodlust. Like hunter gatherer days, I imagine, were so violent, especially as a hunter, right?
And maybe perhaps too that nomadic being of nomadic tendencies allowed you to stay away from most humans, whereas villages may have not have been voluntary, you know, where it's like your nomadic tribe decides to stop in one place because maybe you're blocked by weather or climate or something like that. And then all of a sudden you guys all have to work together in this sort of village now. Whereas you could before, you know, go 100 miles away from them if you didn't want to be around them. Now you have to actually deal with them.
So you just sacrifice them.
The ones that you don't like behind some ruse of a religion.
Yeah.
Go back in time and they're like, what's the term in-laws? I don't know. I love my in-laws, but I'm just saying, like, you know, from a entertainment standpoint, that's funny to put in there.
Well, and to further this, basically, Neolithic humans, as soon as they started to settle down and plant roots into villages, that's when they started to obviously use agriculture. The main first deity being the deity of harvest or the deity of grain, specifically for European Neolithics. But interestingly enough, during the Neolithic culture, or during the Neolithic era, pardon me, the majority of the world was worshiping the Great Mother deity. She took many different shapes for each and every culture, but it is interesting that early humans in the first religions were deifying the goddess and not the god. I think that's kind of interesting because we've talked about this before a little bit with the transition between ancient sort of gods and then more contemporary gods and how that transitioned from a feminine to a masculine archetype. And I do think it's really crazy that basically the first people to sort of conceptualize religion were doing it in accordance with the harvest, and the harvest to them had a intrinsically feminine quality to it.
Wasn't gathering a feminine job? I'm just trying to make sort of sense of it. So if you're not, you know, wandering, grabbing berries, but still harvesting, it could still be seen as taking the feminine rather than the masculine, like hunting. It would be interesting, like if like the second god was like a hunting god, it was masculine, because then it would kind of fix into the gender roles that were there at the time, right?
Right. I definitely think that it is a good catch to the concept, and you know, perhaps, you know, the simple fact that, you know, every human is born from a woman would be enough to be like, hey, these women are important, and, you know, grain and food is important, so let's make them the first deity, you know.
I think that's how it works within the Mayan creation story too, which is good. Maybe even the Aztec one as well, where it's the womb being like the top symbol And so everything starts off in the feminine and then moves out towards the masculine.
Right. Yeah. And so the main reason for human sacrifice during the Neolithic was like we just hinted at, good harvest. That was really what it came down for them. There were no other real instances or reasons as to why they sacrificed, except for ensuring abundance within their harvests. And this would lead heavily to the fact that, like these are the first people to basically put down roots and start agriculture. So the most important thing is to be able to grow your food. And if you're not, yielding enough crops, then you look at the people that you see as, and, to point out what Ayla says, the people that you don't like, that was kind of true. Most of the people that were sacrificed early on were the people that the tribe didn't necessarily like 100%.
Damn, that's messed up.
And it's a mechanism for rooting. It's a mechanism that we use interpersonally to root out the bad actors in our society. It's like that was the way to get those nefarious actors in the society, the ones that weren't helping the collective or weren't helping the tribe or whatever, and give them a purpose, quote unquote.
A sacred purpose.
A very sacred purpose, yes.
It makes me think of the April Fool. So if I remember the story, it's like this town, and you have the town drunkard, right? And he's getting wasted and acting a fool. And on April 1st, like they tricked him and got him to pretty much drown himself. And so it became this ritual sacrifice of the drunkard of the town, because drunkards aren't particularly helpful in anything except for getting drunk. But it makes me think of that story. And ever since then, we celebrate April Fools to play tricks on people. But the original trick is getting somebody to kill themselves.
Hey, gotcha. It's a prank, bro. It's a prank.
It's a prank.
Damn.
But yeah, so and one thing I did want to tack on there too, which I found pretty fascinating, was the concept of the goddess being, one of the first deities to ever emerge, but specifically feminine archetypes with animal hybrids, which I thought was really interesting. For instance, there was a fertility goddess from, I believe it's Mesopotamia. It could be Carthage. It might have been Carthage. It's a statuette of a fertility goddess with the body of a female, but the head of a snake, a lizard person. But apparently back in the day, and during many early civilizations, that was their way of deifying or portraying the female deity, which I thought was just really fascinating. I don't know why the hybridization. I mean, I kind of do, but I don't know if it's as literal as I'm thinking it as. But do you guys have any thoughts on that sort of concept of hybridizing human and animal? We've talked about this before.
Well, I mean, animals come from the natural world. And I don't know about Neolithic humans, but I know modern humans still think that we're somehow like above the natural world. Like there's plants and animals, and there's us. And we're not at all tied to the kingdoms of the world, like that's, which is weird to me. And so I wonder if there's some sort of separation between humans and animals back then creating some sort of a hybrid, if your deity does come from like the natural world, would be the way that you fuse those two. Kind of like how Queen Elizabeth fused, she was like the Virgin Queen. She was having trouble with the religious courts. And so she remolded herself into something beyond human, something that could be revered outside of the normal human ties and therefore untouchable or unquestionable. So I wonder if that's that.
Yeah, I think there's something there for sure. That the marriage of the human with the primordial, with the natural world, obviously, ancient peoples being much more in tune with the natural world. Like it would make sense that you would incorporate the animals from your region into your deity. I think that's probably a pretty fair judgment to say. I don't think that there are any civilizations, and I really should have actually researched this, if there are any civilizations that had like a an animal that wasn't native to their land. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that there would be any way that they could know about animals that weren't native to them unless maybe they heard about them. But yeah, it would seem that, you know, each hybrid is always with an animal that is abundant or from wherever the people live.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So next, I want.
Question.
Yes.
I was just thinking about sacrificing people you don't like, or like the ones that cause trouble. Makes me think of like our modern day prison system, right?
Yeah.
Because those are lives sacrificed. Your life is taken away from you, and it's because you were a troublemaker, right? Like that's, and we accept that, but it's like to reframe that as a sort of sacrifice is quite interesting.
Oh yeah. Well, and later on we're going to get into a little bit of psychology, and it's quite interesting as to what that sort of mechanism does for a society as well, and we'll talk about that. Yeah, but I wanted to continue a little bit about the ancient world, and so I mentioned the Neolithic. Their, you know, main deity tended to be a female with a hybrid of an animal. I couldn't get any names for that, but then I moved on to the city of Ur, which is one of the oldest cities. It's in modern day Iraq right now. It was once a coastal city near the mouth of the Euphrates on the Persian Gulf, and it was about 9 miles away from modern Iraq. Oh, okay. So it's off. It was on the Euphrates. Sorry, I got that messed up. But because over time the climate has shifted, the Euphrates actually moved 9 miles away from where it is now. So the city of Ur was right on the waters of the Euphrates, but now it is currently 9 miles away. And it was in the period, the Ubaid period, pardon me, circa 3800. And it's recorded in the history of the city-states of the 26th century BC. It's the first recorded, basically city by King. I'm not even going to get that one up, right? Anyways, they worshipped a moon god named Nana, also called Sin. And what they found under the city of Ur was about 20,000 child urns, and they speculate that those were sacrifices as well. I couldn't get a whole lot of information on that because actually there's a lot of people that are still fighting over that, but it's pretty well understood that Ur was one of the more modern cities and one of the oldest cities that was doing that type of stuff. Then we have the Carthaginians, which is a little bit more famous, a little bit more, if people who are familiar with the Bible will probably know. Carthage was in modern day Tunisia, basically, which is in Africa, but it's northeast Africa, sorry. So it was on the Mediterranean. So it had a lot of mixing with the Egyptians and the Greeks at the time. And the Carthaginians were apparently well known for their child sacrifices. And the date, or the child sacrifices, dated back to the city's founding in about 814 BC. And sacrificing children was apparently distasteful even to the Carthaginians, but according to Plutarch, they began to seek alternatives to offering up their own children, such as buying children from poor families or raising servant children instead. Carthage's priests reportedly demanded youth in times of crisis, such as war, drought, or famine. And extreme crises warranted special ceremonies whereupon 200 children at the most affluent and powerful families were slain and tossed into a burning pyre.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right? Could you imagine having to be like a wealthy person and then like the city starts doing poorly and it's like, all right, well, give us your kids now. We're going to burn them.
200? Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. But I mean, again, this is another check and balance system, isn't it? Like you think about this type of like it's because they're burning the rich people's children when extreme crisis happen. And you think about that what does that encourage? Well, it encourages altruism within the elite to make sure that the lowest aren't suffering, right?
Some kind of agenda here. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I don't.
Assuming that the elite like their children.
Assuming that the elite, yes, of course. Well, they like them enough to try to buy other children to sacrifice. So yeah.
Oh, that's why they did it. So they would
Yes.
adopt poor children
Mhm.
so that those could be the one.
Yep.
So they
So
would.
that
That's good.
it's fucked up, right?
It's so fucked up. It's so fucked up. And that's
Yeah, so
terrible to even say that that's worse because it's still innocent children, but it is
Yes.
like just ewy. Ah.
Yeah, I mean, so basically, it was the reason that the rich started buying the children is because the priests were demanding the children of the affluent, most powerful families. So they just said, "All right, well, loophole, we'll buy some retainer children, and anytime there's there's a crisis, we'll just offer them up as sacrifice."
I'm curious what all the women were thinking back then. It is a lot of work to manufacture a child, and then for
Yes,
them
it
to just
is.
be slaughtering them like it's
Well,
nothing.
And
Did
that's
you
an
just say
excellent
manufacture a child.
Yes.
Oh yeah, birthing. Sorry.
Well, that's an excellent point, Ayla. It was something that I was probably going to bring up later, but I can bring it up now. And it's a question that I thought while I was working through this whole episode is how in the world in an era where there are maybe, I would say, 20 million people on the planet, how in the world were humans so expendable? Like it's so crazy to me that for what seems to be at least a few thousand years, humans were just offing each other like nothing. Like there was no value to human life.
I'm sure they were having lots of kids. I'm sure they had higher death rates and probably shorter lifespans, right?
Oh, I'm sure they had shorter lifespans for sure.
Yeah, and there's humans, like, they didn't have numbers. They didn't know there's only, like, there's tons of humans around. We see them everywhere. We can just chuck one into the fire and it'll be okay.
Yeah, I guess. I just think it's interesting now that we have 7 billion people on the planet where, like, human life is much more valuable to us. I mean, maybe it's the chicken coming before the egg, or the cart before the carrot, or before the horse. I guess maybe it's that we have 7 billion in the people on the planet because we started to value human life.
Yeah, I think we somewhere along the way we started to care more. Like, it almost seems, because it's all demanded by the aesthetic class, by the priests and stuff like that. So there's like a level of ignorance there. Right? They don't know how to take a civilization and turn it around properly through like known means at the time.
Right, they're not engineers.
Yeah, like, well, I mean, at least not maybe economists, or like the level of knowledge hasn't raised up to that point yet where they can point out the problem very obviously. So they turn to the priests, and the priests are like, well, in our religion, we just sacrifice kids, and that will make times better. For some reasons. Like, maybe there's one less mouth to feed, so now it becomes easier. I don't know. So then, like, that becomes the ingrained solution. But as humans get smarter, as our civilizations become more quote unquote civilized, I guess, or learn more, then they don't have a need to turn to those sorts of things.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think too, wars have become less fatal. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of respects, like, I think I saw a stat that was looking at the number of dead in past wars and comparing it, over time, and it's still a large number, but it's been going down. And then I'm just looking at a chart of life expectancy by era, and in the Neolithic era, it was 20 to 33.
Damn.
So your elders would be
21.
33, 21. Yeah, I mean, like, so you have to wonder too, like, and that makes me think too, because like the human brain, the way it evolves, I think there's certain age cutoffs. Like, I think at 20, 21, maybe early 30s is when you see a shift in the brain. And I'm just curious, like, as you started to see older humans emerge if that had anything to do with the shaping of things, because your elders get older and then you have more experience to lean on. Oral history can be much more coherently transported to the next generations. I think it'd be kind of interesting to think about it that way.
Yeah, maybe there was like a really old 35-year-old that was like, yeah, we tried sacrificing kids that one time and it didn't work. So maybe we shouldn't do that anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like I've made it to 90 and I've seen 3 rounds of sacrificing of kids and it made no difference.
Right. You mean I made it to 40?
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, and it doesn't get much better. Early Middle Ages, 30 to 35. Pre-Columbian Southern United States, 25 to 30. 18th century China, 39.6. Edo, Japan, 41. That's crazy.
Yeah, life expectancy really hasn't increased all but for the last like 150 years, 200 years. Yeah. Good. Thank you, sanitation.
Right. Modern medicine. Yeah, all sorts of things.
Totally. Okay, well then let's move on because there are some types of sacrifices that I wanted to just briefly categorize for you so that when we talk about other things, you guys can kind of know, because we were talking about the reasons for sacrificing. And really when I was doing my research, I came across 3 good solid reasons that kind of explained the bulk of them. Now, obviously there are exceptions to this and there are, many different other reasons, but there are 3 notable ones that seem to be the biggest. And the one that we've talked about already, which is the winning favors from the gods. Very important. Want a good harvest, you got to sacrifice. You want, the gods to bless you for a war, you got to sacrifice. Any of those things, basically, you want something from God, you got to start spilling blood. Which is, I'm glad that God has evolved as well. And
too much blood. We can't.
Yeah, it's too much blood. I'm done with all of it.
That's why he came down and was like, guys, seriously.
Yeah, you got to stop. You got to stop killing each other.
You want to keep the red stuff in you. I know when you harvest, you see a bunch of the plant's blood. That does not mean you get to harvest each other for good harvest.
And then what did we do to his son?
We cut him open.
We're horrible. Oh my god.
Yes, we're wretched beings.
Humans.
Yes. The second instance or second example would have been completion of a task. So you think the building of a temple is quite obviously like a completion of a task. Many times we've heard about the sacrificing of the Aztecs, or even the Egyptians did it. There were many cultures that did it throughout the years. Every time there was a temple, there was a sacrifice. And usually that person was buried in the foundation of the temple itself. Except for the Aztecs, they did things a little bit different. But yeah, I mean, then the third was, which is my favorite, it's called retainer sacrifice. And those were the unlucky son of a bitches that had been in the employ of a king or, a royal. When the royal died, they died too. I mean, like, so really, what a life. Yeah.
There's some parallels there, but we won't get into that.
Oh God.
Oh, there's parallels going through this entire episode. The more I went through it, the more I'm like, oh God, nothing's changed. But so those are the type of concepts we kind of understand with ancient Egypt and the pharaohs, but many different cultures have done this. The Chinese notably as well. Mesopotamians used to do it. I believe the Japanese did it once in a while, but definitely in European areas as well was this concept of a retainer sacrifice. So basically, if you're in an employ of royalty and that royalty dies, you're dead too, because you got to serve them in the afterlife. And that's just the way it goes.
Freaking greedy. I mean, like, it's not enough to be rich and to be waited on hand and foot. No. All the people that helped you out have to die and help you out in death too, because you're that important. What the hell?
Yep. Yeah,
Makes me so mad.
we're real twisted motherfuckers when it comes down to it. It's
We
like
were just this like few jerky. Anyway,
it's not a few, babe. It's trust me.
well, I'm thinking about like how many people were emperors and rulers.
Oh yeah. For the retainer stuff for sure, but then there was plenty of other sacrifices going on. That,
Well, yeah, if I have a chance of working somewhere and being murdered, I might as well go murder some people too. I mean, just murder everybody.
Fair enough.
I'm not gonna live very long anyways.
It's
Just
like a
murder
murder
all.
Right.
Oh, God, so terrified.
And so those are the three types that I wanted to just mention to you because you guys will probably harken back to them when we talk about methods. And I lifted this list off of a website that I was looking through that kind of listed about several different methods in which people were sacrificed. And I'll try not to go too deep into each of them. There is one that I want to explore more than others, and that's at the end. So we'll get to that. But the first one I saw was the Wicker Man. And this is ancient Britain. The Wicker Man was reportedly used by ancient Druids or Celtic paganism to sacrifice in effigy. Now, it was usually a large man in the basically made out of wicker or very thin wood lashings in the shape of a man. They would burn as in effigy as a sacrifice, but what they also used to do was stick people inside them. And if anybody knows the iconic and fantastic film The Wicker Man with Nicolas Cage, that's exactly what happens in that movie, or at least what tries to happen in that movie. The Wicker Man was one that was ancient Britain. Dismemberment was very popular in China. In the Shang Dynasty, that lasted for about 500 years, was the first recorded period in ancient Chinese history. And it was also home to brutal techniques focused on ripping apart the bodies of those who were sacrificed. Shang human sacrifice victims were burned, split into halves, beheaded, or chopped up. And the first common ceremonies were pit foundation and interment sacrifices. So for pit sacrifices, young men were ripped apart and then buried without their possessions. For foundation sacrifices involved children and infants, while interment sacrifices focused on young women. So they were doing the whole gamut there in China. You got to cover all your bases, right? You got to make sure. You don't know what the gods are into that day. It's like, all right, well, do you want a baby or do you want a young woman?
Just have a buffet of humans.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
But the ripping apart, that has just got to be the worst. Like, like the idea of like being drawn and quartered, where like they have horses go in opposite directions,
just rip you apart. Yeah.
I mean, like, can you just imagine? Like, what is the first thing to rip? And then
all your sockets, and then your skin.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you look this up?
Well, I mean, I've seen. Your
sockets. God.
Yeah.
Oh,
Nick,
God.
have you drawn and quartered somebody? Is this what you're trying to say?
No, he's definitely heard me screaming for the past 2 months,
That's
trying
true.
to stretch out my knee. Jesus.
Yeah. And the Hawaiians like to do things a little bit differently. They like the human piñata. So they hung their sacrifices upside down to appease the god Ku, who was the god of war and defense. And in order to ensure victory in future battles, captives from enemy tribes, especially the chiefs, were sacrificed in sacred temples through a variety of means, but including being hung upside down and then bludgeoned until they bled to death. They were then disemboweled, and the remaining flesh was either cooked or eaten raw by the priest and the tribe. Yeah.
Wow.
It's a little bit of cannibalism as well. That's always fun.
I mean, just
You got to
don't
gain
fuck
the
them.
powers.
You got to gain the power.
Oh, God.
We did talk just briefly about the ancient Egyptians, which was their retainer sacrifices, which were being buried alive. Fun fact, the servants actually didn't die. They weren't killed when they were sent into the tombs. They just had to sit there and die at some point, just slowly.
Oh my
Do you think
god.
they ran out of oxygen, or do you think they
Pretty
starved
much,
to death?
yeah. They probably ran out of oxygen first, for
One
sure.
would hope that means.
Yeah. Mesopotamians did things very straightforward. They just like to bop you on the head. Usually blunt force trauma to the head. But like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, the royals of ancient Mesopotamia, they were buried with the rest of their household, and this included some members of a royal court, such as soldiers, handmaidens, and servants. Human remains found at an archaeological dig in which we talked about just previously, attested to more than 2,000 people being sacrificed in this way. And their main mode of operandi was to poison the person who was being sacrificed. But sometimes the poison didn't take, and so that's when they would take a large club and then just bash your brains in.
Oh,
Could you imagine you're like getting poisoned and then it doesn't work? You're like, oh my God, I think I might live. And they're just like, not today.
Oh god. Well, as you're reading that last one, it makes
Mhm.
me think about like the modern day cults and the sacrifices that happen, at the end
Mhm.
of some of them.
Mhm.
And it's like, okay, so lately I've been doing more reading on ancient wisdom and thinking about like, what did we lose that we could stand to, you know, reinvigorate today. And it's like, is that what the cultists did? Did they go, oh, we stopped sacrificing. Let's bring that back. And like, I don't know. And that's the thing is, it's like, to me, there's some ancient knowledge that seems relevant today, and that it could be healing or it could be soothing. It could help give us a sense of peace about the world. But it's that line, right?
Mm.
It's all well and good till you cross over into bopping folks on the head and burying them alive. It's like there has to be a point
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
the law of diminishing returns, and it's like it'd be cool to like science-fy the ancient wisdom and to have kind of like vetted ancient wisdom where it's like, okay, you don't want to do this stuff anymore, but this stuff is still kind of cool. Like,
Well, and through a lot of this, the reward for sacrificing a human usually was worth it to the person doing the sacrificing, and it usually came with a certain level of power. So like that in itself seems like a magical system that just seems true in reality, like, because that's the way the animal kingdom works, right?
yeah.
You kill something, you eat, or you get to retain the territory that you're in. So like it's a very just like A B sort of, like binary, do it, fight or flight sort of thing. So it's like
Right.
it seems interesting to me that that the rewards to do something like that tend to be worth it to the people that do it.
But then like Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart, like we're at a point now where like you were talking about earlier, there would be no reward worth killing another person. Like, like the ickiness
Yes,
of
but we
having done that is
moved
so bad.
right,
And like,
and yes, go ahead.
well, just like over time, like when did that shift? And I think that's what you were
We'll get
talking
into that.
about.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. We're going to talk about the what kind of well, at least mythologically, what stopped human sacrifice. And this sort of spread throughout the West and much through Europe and the Middle East. But to continue on, and speaking of a telltale heart, we talk about the removal of the heart from the Aztecs. Now, I didn't want to get too much into the Aztec stuff because I know Mike is itching to do an episode about Aztec rituals. But suffice to
I
say,
gotta perform one first, though. I've been
there
looking
you go.
for a good heart to live out.
Nice. Fair enough. But the Aztecs usually worshipped a pantheon of gods, and they believed that they had to be appeased through the blood of sacrifice, both animal and human. Archaeologists estimated that a few thousand people were sacrificially slain every year for this purpose. And many of those were actually prisoners of war. So not as, like I'm sure that any time they had some prisoners left over, they used those instead of their own people, but sometimes you run out of prisoners, and you got to do it yourself. But during the sacrifice rituals to the sun god, the victims was forced to walk up many steps of a temple. At the top, a priest cut the person open from throat to stomach. The heart was then removed and offered to the god. then the person was was pushed from the top of the temple down the stairs to the bottom, where they were dismembered or taken away.
Oh God.
That's the way to go.
Dude, you get your heart taken
pretty
out and then
hardcore.
kicked down a flight of stairs. That's so fucked up.
Yeah. There were some ceremonies too that would end like that in sacrifice, but like before the sacrifice happened, for a full year you lived as the god that you were going
that's
to be
right.
sacrificed
Yeah.
as. So like for
Mhm.
a year you were like
You have the
anything
best
you
life.
wanted. Yeah,
Right.
you have the best life with it. And then there's just this one day where you got to walk up a bunch of stairs.
So
You
fucked
just
up.
don't want to think about, but just,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
just gotta,
I wonder if anybody like left the day that they were supposed to be sacrificed. They're like, I'm getting the fuck out of here. And just ran.
And then you have to they like the Aztecs had some really good eagle warriors, like they would, or like jaguar warriors. They would hunt you down in those
Oh, I'm
jungles.
sure.
You would have to try to make it to some other village as quickly as possible.
Right. And then you just get killed by them. So there you go.
Yeah,
It's a hostile world out there.
it's a different human sacrifice ceremony without the year of being treated as a god.
That 9 to 5 ain't looking so bad now, huh?
Right, exactly.
I was thinking, like how like that wisdom part stuff that you were talking about, the things we shouldn't continue, how they just get transformed.
Yeah.
Because
Mhm.
they're like, when you see people get fired, especially public figures, there's like this weird human sacrifice
Mhm.
ritualistic high that people get.
Oh yeah.
Where they all get
Mhm.
Yeah.
very happy that somebody was thrown off the boat. And like, if someone gets fired, you don't see them again, right? So they're basically dead. So like it's
Ooh,
still
and there's
quite-
like a beating of adjectives.
Well, and you think about canceling, right? Canceling is the new human sacrifice.
and you
That's
still
like
they
it's
get
just on
those
the digital
highs.
platform. Yep. But let's continue on to our continue with our friends from south of the border. The Mayans used to toss people in cenotes. Those are those beautiful paradisical looking watering holes in the Amazon rainforest that people like to swim in. And I've always said to myself, do you know that there's like hundreds of dead bodies at the bottom of that thing?
Oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because the Mayans' ritual was to sacrifice them by throwing them into these giant cenotes. So they were just giant limestone wells that were born from heavy rainfall. So they'd have water at the bottom, but they'd be like 200 feet up, and so you just push people off of that, and then they'd die, obviously. But a lot of people go swimming in those cenotes, especially the ones near Chichen Itza. People go swimming in those cenotes, and I'm like, dude, they killed people in those things. I don't know if you want to swim in that.
It's
Right.
refreshing and reinvigorating, right?
Okay.
You're getting the power through the water.
I guess so. Maybe.
Yeah.
And then to talk about Japan, the concept of honor suicide has been around for a very long time. The honorary form of self-sacrifice called seppuku, or also known as harikari. And this practice was many of ritualized aspects of the life of the samurai in feudal Japan. And the samurai committed seppuku for various reasons, as punishment for a crime, or to restore honor, or even to show solidarity with a recent deceased lord, kind of like that retainer sacrifice. The rituals had several steps. First, the warrior ate his favorite meal, dressed in his best robes, drank sake, and wrote, then recited a death poem. Next, he thrust a dagger into his left side of his own abdomen, believed to release his spirit, and then drew the blade literally or laterally to the right, and then turned the blade upward. The end of the ceremony required an assistant called a kaishakunin to finish the sacrifice by decapitating the samurai.
It's so hardcore. I could
So
do
hardcore, dude. I'm going to have a nice meal. I'm going to have some sake, and then I'm going to recite a death poem before I stab myself in the stomach.
Draw that blade to the other side and then up to the heart.
Good
And if I
lord.
mess up, someone's going to cut my head off. It'll be fine.
Pretty much.
But the will to like not only stab yourself, but to
Then drag it, and then
Right.
drag it up.
in the stomach. God,
But you're restoring your honor or
That's
showing your
right.
loyalty.
not
That's
Those
right.
are
worth it. Take
extremely
it.
important
It's
things.
so important
So
that you have.
dishonorable.
I know, right?
I'm just bald.
That's how you know we're not Japanese, though, because I would just be like, "Nah, I'm good. I don't. I think I'm just gonna go do something else."
I don't need this honor thing.
Yeah,
Oh my gosh.
I need this honor like I need a knife through the belly. Hey,
Right.
okay, so the next I wanted to talk about, which I have a little bit more on because I just thought it's one of the more fascinating ones for me, but it's the Thuggy death cult. And
Thuggy?
yeah, Thuggy.
Ooh.
The Thuggy from India, and they reigned for hundreds of years and only ended in 1830. And it was an organized crew of dangerous outlaws known as thugs or Thuggy. And they brutally sacrificed more than 30,000 people throughout India. And they're considered a cult of religious assassins by some. The superstitious thugs found targets following natural phenomenon they believed to be omens. They ended their target in a variety of ways, including strangling them with handkerchiefs. The sacrifice was meant to honor Kali, the goddess of creation, preservation, and destruction. Thugs would disguise themselves as travelers, merchants, or soldiers to gain the trust of their targets. And despite its bloody activities, the cult had a strict code of ethics. According to one source, they were prohibited from sacrificing musicians, dancers, sweepers, oil vendors, carpenters, blacksmiths, maimed or leprous persons, and then Ganges water carriers and women. So they had a myriad of people who they weren't allowed to slay. However, they would sometimes slay women if it was necessary.
What?
If you look, we don't slay women, but if you have to, go ahead, no problem.
That's just messed up.
I know, right? Don't kill the carpenter, but you can kill that woman if you want.
Jeez, I wonder what those trials was like. It's like, so you killed a woman, and what did she do? All right, you're fine. Go on your way.
Well, they just thought Kali was speaking to them. So what is weird about these guys is that they would just roam around India, and you could be an unsuspecting victim. They just might lock on to you, and then they would think, probably because they were doing a lot of opium and drugs and stuff, they would think that Kali was telling them to kill you. And
what if
so
she was?
Maybe she was speaking through them. So the murderous craft actually of the Thuggy was hereditary. Its practitioners were trained from the earliest of childhood to murder by the quiet method of a strong cloth noose tightened around the neck of their victims. This weapon, called the rumal, was worn knotted around the waist of each member of the Thuggy. And the strongest rule of the Brotherhood was the one prohibiting the shedding of blood. According to Thuggy beliefs, the goddess Kali taught the fathers of thuggery to strangle with a noose and to kill without permitting the flow of blood. All victims of the Thuggy were sacrificed to Kali, and the members of the secret society would have been greatly incensed by the accusation that they killed only for riches.
No, looks like
Yeah.
Assassin's Creed.
Yeah. Well, you think of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. They didn't get the Thuggy quite right, but those were Thuggy, the guys that were a part of the death cult, because they weren't supposed to be spilling blood. Although I don't know if they were. They ripped out his heart without any bloodshed, so maybe
Pretty
they were
sure those
doing
were
it right.
The ratings, though? No.
yeah. I'm pretty sure that wasn't scientific, but you know. But I just thought that was really interesting, the concept of the Thuggy, and that's where we get the colloquialism thugs. That comes from Thuggy and these sort of roving murderers that apparently killed for hundreds of years.
Well, you know what terrifies me is this idea of like having omens that could attach them and make anybody a victim. You know, it's like I think I was watching that documentary about the guy that was in New York just shooting people point blank in their cars. What was his name?
Son of Sam?
Yeah, Son of Sam. And the documentary was about this guy that was doing research and saying that like he wasn't alone and that it was part of this like larger group of people who were like Yeah, kind of like sacrificing people. But then the documentary turned it around again, and they were saying like the ultimate sacrifice was this guy who sacrificed his whole life trying to unearth this conspiracy that never came to fruition. It's super meta.
Hmm. Hmm.
Mm.
Meta. Um, let's see. Oh, okay. So I also wanted to bring up to you guys the gods of sacrifice, at least the gods of sacrifice that were in more of the ancient traditions. Now we just talked about Kali being the god of the Thuggy, and her sort of influencing them to kill random people. Um, and Ayla just mentioned Son of Sam as well, which had sort of similar beliefs about the guy that thought God was talking to him. And, you know, we've seen that portrayal many, many times before. But there were three main gods that I found in my research that were all kind of in the Levant areas of the Middle East. And the three are Milcom, Sin, and Moloch. And what's interesting about all of these is that they come from different areas. So Milcom would have been an Ammonite, which is, I believe, that is the Semitic. So that would have been like Hebrews, early Hebrews. Sin comes from the Mesopotamians, which was also Nana, which is, we talked about the city of Ur, worshiping Nana, the lunar god, was also sort of the same god as Sin. And then we have Moloch, which is kind of an amalgamation of all of these sacrifice demanding gods of the Middle East. What's interesting, though, that I wanted to talk about was that each of these gods has the imagery of the bull. In particular, a horned bull that demands the sacrifice of humans. And I thought that was really strange to me, and I wanted to bring it up to you guys because I want to see what you guys think. But it's odd to me that each of these gods that were apparently demanding human sacrifices were images of the bull. And I don't know what that means, to be honest. I don't know if there's actually any meaning, but it seemed like it stuck out to me for some reason. We think of the concept of the devil and having horns, and then we have this concept of these ancient gods with horns that were demanding, you know, sacrifice of humans and children. Do you think that that's kind of where we got the concept of the devil?
Maybe the horns component.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be too sure. I wonder like how that image was shared, or like if like they came up with them independently. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I wouldn't. It's interesting that they all share the same image of a bull, but my guess would be sure like the way that we sort of derived different images of like came from pagan places, right? Or came from older religious places. So I can see where the horns from these sacrificial gods end up being put on the devil.
Yeah. I just think it's strange that the bull becomes that sort of like that thing. I don't know what it is about a bull that maybe it's because agriculture was so important back to those people that, you know, having a bull that could, you know, plow or help, you know, with bearing burden, maybe. And maybe they sought high value to the bull.
Yeah. Maybe bulls were hard to stop and killing people back then too.
Maybe there's just a lot of them running amok.
Or maybe they were like angrier back then, you know.
Maybe, yeah.
Like fierce bulls. I mean, like have you gone to a rodeo before?
Mm-mm.
And you see those like rodeo bulls, and they're just like drooling, and they're angry, and they're kicking and jumping, and they make horrible sounds. So I could
they
see
don't
it
seem
being really
like they're very
frightening.
friendly. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I was in Laos once, and like I turned a corner, and I became like face to face with a water buffalo. Huge horns. I mean, the horns on a water buffalo, it's like, sounds like an exaggeration, but I want to say it's like 8 feet. Like they're huge. They're quite large.
Longhorns have like 10-foot, you know, wide horns.
Okay, so like
Yeah.
on par, and this one was like definitely taller than me, and I'm about like, well, I don't want to say my height, but I mean, I'm not short, and I remember being very intimidated by the bull. I just slowly walked away, but
Yeah, they're gigantic creatures. So yeah, I
yeah,
guess they're formidable. They have, horns to defend and to also attack. Yeah, I could see, they're strong.
To be
Yeah.
appeased, right? You're
And
appeasing
yeah,
angry gods through the
that's true.
sacrifice.
Yeah, and bulls are always
um,
ornery. So yeah, that makes sense.
yeah. Well, and to think about it, like, okay, you wouldn't want to pray to a predator because in your world, a predator just kills.
Mhm,
So your god has to be fearsome and strong, but it
mhm.
can't just be vicious. And I feel like a bull, like if they had cows with milk and cheese and you can eat cows, like
Yeah,
you
they would be
might have,
protecting the herd.
yeah, you might have some sort of like symbiotic relationship with the bull where it's like you're not
Mhm.
on great terms, but you need it and you need to kind of like revere and protect it in some way.
Yeah, because it in turn protects your cattle and your livestock.
Mhm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Good call, guys. I wasn't able to really connect those dots before, so I appreciate it. Um, but yeah, let's talk about what kind of stopped human sacrifice, or at least mythologically speaking. One is a mythological sort of interpretation, and then the other is a religious sort of interpretation. But this is sort of east meets west. And the first example that a lot of my research pointed back to as kind of the pinnacle of the concept is called the Binding of Isaac. And for those who are familiar with the Old Testament, you would be familiar with the concept of Abraham, and God's dictate to Abraham to bring his son Isaac up to the altar and sacrifice him. And so, according to the Hebrew Bible, God commands Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And after Isaac is bound to an altar, a messenger God stops Abraham before the sacrifice finishes, saying, "Now I know you fear God." Abraham looks and sees a ram and sacrifices it instead of Isaac. And so Isaac death, and this is a rabbinical interpretation of the concept. It says that Isaac's death was never a possibility, not as far as Abraham was concerned, not as far as God was concerned. God's commandment to Abraham was very specific, and Abraham understood it precisely. Isaac was to be raised up as an offering, and God would use the opportunity to teach humankind once and for all that human sacrifice, child sacrifice, is not acceptable. And so this is a very famous story in the Old Testament that God came to Abraham. I think isn't that's Bob Dylan, right? God came to Abraham, said, "Give me a son." Yeah, I think that's Bob Dylan. But yeah, it's a very famous story about Abraham having to give up his son to God, only for God to stop him at the last moment, be like, "Haha, I fooled you. Don't do that." And here's a ram to sacrifice instead. And surprisingly, a lot of the research that I did points to this mythology as the one of the stories that has stopped human sacrifice in the West. So whether it's true or not, that myth became something more than true because it helped create a policy of no more human sacrifice
Hmm.
for many, many cultures.
It, it makes sense, right? Like earlier in the show, you stated how human sacrifice tended to be very strongly tied in with religion. And
Mhm.
so then as the rise of, new religions come out past the ancient point, now the focus changes from sacrificing humans to not sacrificing,
Mhm.
right? As far as, the monotheistic religions rise or the Abrahamic religions rise. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see it beginning the change, right? Because then this
Mhm.
religion spreads and it becomes the faith base for humans.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely, definitely. And in
I wonder.
yes, Ayla,
I was
sorry.
just gonna say, I wonder if it's a bit of that tipping point as well, where it's like after so many years of sacrificing, I would imagine people would get kind of fed up with it. It's a bit stressful.
Hmm.
Might be a bit wasteful once you start to realize that having a lot of humans can help build stuff and move things forward. Um, and then comes along an idea where it's like, well, it's not about actually sacrificing, it's about offering the sacrifice,
Hmm.
and you didn't have to go so far. And then it's like everybody can get on board with that. It's
Yeah,
kind of like,
it helps the
why.
religion spread too, because it takes the
Mhm.
literal and puts it metaphorical, and it's a lot easier for people to swallow that.
Yeah, and I think too, it's like if everybody's thinking it, it just takes one person to actually say it, and then everyone to be like, "That's a really good idea. That sounds right.
Hmm.
Let's do that." Um, and I
Well, and I
think,
think this. Yo, sorry. Go ahead.
just thinking about intuition.
Hmm.
Like, do you think God wants you to murder a bunch of people?
Right.
Does does that feel right? Maybe it stopped after a while. Once people started in numbers to be like, this doesn't feel right.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it's a really important sort of delineation when we decided that okay, the concept of sacrifice no longer is literal. It's
Mm.
it's metaphysical, it's symbolic, it's metaphorical. I think that that's really interesting, and perhaps it just served as a vehicle to spread, like Mike said, just spread Abrahamic religion,
Mm.
making it more palatable for everybody, so they didn't actually have to kill their firstborn child. They could just make an offering of ram to God, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe too. This is the point where we start caring more about human life.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that this is kind of the pivot point right here. And my next example, which will kind of represent it in the East, is a pivot point as to where like people's priorities started to switch. So for the West and for, like Middle East and parts of Africa and Europe, it was the Abrahamic story of Isaac. And, that for some reason that mythology, and I couldn't track it any farther. I'm sure it comes to things like I do believe that there's a sort of facsimile in the Iliad, but that's after. So but Homer does do that with Agamemnon. Agamemnon's supposed to sacrifice his daughter to win the war against the Trojans, only to be stopped at the last minute and told not to sacrifice humans anymore. So this concept kind of memified and
Mm.
started to spread everywhere. And more cultures started to pick it up and interpret it into their own religions or maybe just into their own ethos. And that's just how the idea spread.
Makes sense.
Hmm. The second concept that I wanted to talk about was it's called Ahimsa, which is a Jainist and Buddhist concept, and this kind of covers the eastern portion of the old world. And it's honestly just the concept of it, it's what is it simply? It's inspired by the premise that all living beings have the sparks of the divine spiritual energy, and therefore to hurt another being is to hurt oneself. And so ahimsa is also been related to the notion of any violence has karmic consequences. And so it is this ethical concept that evolved in Vedic texts, and the oldest scriptures indirectly mention ahimsa, but do not emphasize it. But over time, the Hindu scripts revise ritual practices, and the concept of ahimsa becomes increasingly refined and emphasized until ahimsa becomes the highest virtue by the late Vedic era around 500 BCE. So it seems that at some point, and this kind of would be close to, I guess, where the Old Testament would be, anyways, as well, maybe in a couple thousand years BC, 1,000 years BC. And it's this, for the Eastern, they called it ahimsa, but it's just this concept that you understand that there's a spark of divinity in the other person. And so to do harm to that person is also incurring some sort of soul debt to yourself.
Mm. Makes sense to me. I mean, yeah, you don't want to harm. I mean, well, yeah, like in Reiki principles, one of the things you meditate on is do no harm.
Mhm.
And that's supposed to help keep your you know, abilities in tune and aligned. And it, again, too, it's this shifting of intuition. You know, like it does seem that if God made all of us, He doesn't probably want us to then destroy one another. It just, I mean,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah.
why do that? Um,
And it could be the concept of being created in the image of God too that really became a sort of anchor to dissuade this type of ritualism.
is
Because if you are made in God's image, then every human is made in God's image, and to kill a human would be almost an affront to God because it's almost killing a piece of God.
So is that the emphasis earlier that you made on the part human, part animal deities? That
Hmm.
perhaps once our deities became more humanized,
Hmm.
then it was us in their image rather than their image being something beyond us.
Right. And then the animal doesn't need to be fed because it's no longer an animal, it's us.
Ah, look at that. The evolution of God, so to speak.
Hmm. Hmm.
This is when I think that I should have taken like a master's in theology or something like that. Because it
I
is
would have loved
so
to. Yeah.
fascinating, isn't
It's
it?
very fascinating. Yeah. The concepts are so deep and rich, and I just love I love the anthropology mixed with the theology stuff. It's very fascinating.
Well, and it's like really, it's like it touches on a nerve. It's like it's like the warm chocolate chip cookie version of existentialism or something like that, you
Yeah.
know? Because it's like it's touching on an uncertainty and questioning that everybody has, but it comes at it from a different perspective, from lineages of people versus this kind of like emptiness kind of questioning and just questions. And I only say that because I went to a funeral 2 years ago, and the person that had passed, um, they did they did earn a master's in theology, and so everybody that spoke, they were like professors of theology, or they worked in schools, like different divination schools, and I mean like best funeral I'd ever been to. I mean, it was horrible situation, but like the words that people spoke it was just so like impactful. Like I
Mm.
still remember all of the speeches that were said that day, and like what a way to honor a life, and also too like what a way to live, to constantly be thinking about these things in terms of like the answers, rather like the possible answers rather than the question alone.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and to sort of wrap this in a nice bow, as far as how we decided to see God as more human and less as a animal. If you recall, we were talking about the three gods prior and their symbolism with the bull and the bull animalism. It is interesting that the binding of Isaac turns that concept on its head. So instead of sacrificing human life to an animal deity, you sacrifice an animal to a human deity. And that's where the ram comes in, because the ram is that sort of tie in to the older religions, Baal, Moloch, these horned gods that would require human sacrifices. Now, this religion is saying, hey, no, God wants you to sacrifice this horned animal instead. And so
Interesting.
perhaps that was a way of integrating previous beliefs and sort of modernizing them as well.
Well, it's also kind of cruel too, because, like when you think about the evolution of monotheism, it came at the conquering of peoples that had these more natural gods, or, you know, animal like gods. And so to basically say like, okay, we're going to absorb you and we're going to be sacrificing your god on repeat, a little hard to swallow. Like, I'm sure in the moment, probably not that great, but over time, like when you look back, it is interesting that as a group of humans on an earth, that we
Mhm.
started to trend that way too.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Mike, you got anything?
I wonder if there's just sort of from like trying to engineer a civilization. If there came a point when specialization had become so advanced that we couldn't afford to have human sacrifices of certain types,
Hmm.
and so then the religious stories have to change,
Hmm.
right? Like, because civilization's all predicated on specializations, and maybe somewhere at some point, person A couldn't cover person's B job anymore, or something like that within the civilization itself.
Hmm.
And though, if you have a bunch of people being sacrificed all the time, you
You
kind of
lose that. Yeah.
you lose the ability to move forward as a civilization.
Yeah,
And
you lose labor. It was one thing when you're just casually picking berries throughout the day, but if you have to be in the fields farming, yeah.
and now we're doing far different stuff. I mean, like, now we're building complex metals. Your
Hmm.
civilization is starting to take off. So those religious stories as being sort of the backbone of it, or the backbone of the morals that ran the whole village, if those needed to change in order to keep civilization going forward. And if
Hmm.
that played into a bit of why these stories also started to become a bit more popular, because then you didn't have to kill your neighbor. Your
It
neighbor
was easy
helped
for
you.
society.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think you're right on the money there, especially with the specialization and just like less people become less and less expendable because they have specialized skills that contribute to the society as a whole. And then you're like, well, I can't kill this guy because he makes good bread, or I can't kill that guy because he knows actually how to shape, stone. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
But
yeah,
I can kill your god,
right,
and
exactly.
then bring you
Yeah.
under seeing things the way that I see them, which helps us with social cohesion and then pushes things forward again.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I'm sure that there's some truth in that for sure. And so before we wrap up, I wanted to jump into just a little bit of psychology because I was looking for like more philosophical takes on human sacrifice, but I wasn't able to find a lot. What I did find was takes from Sigmund Freud, and his name is Rene Girard. So Freud wrote a little bit about human sacrifice in his writings called Totem and Taboo, where he claimed that ritualistic killings of other human beings were manifestations of an intrinsic destructive impulse of the human ego, kind of like what you were talking about, Mike. That innate sort of drive for humans to destroy something. And so he says that for Freud, human sacrifice, though it may seem like an exceptionally savage type of practice, is in fact a form of collective manifestations of our basic personal neuroses. um, and so, therefore, drawing upon his theories of the fundamental structure of human psyche, Freud claims that the underlying impulses of sacrificial killings are always present, though societies may find ways to redirect its compulsive neurosis towards less violent rituals that substitute the functions of human sacrifice. Kind of like what we were alluding to, the way that we've kind of evolved human sacrifice away from innate violence to something akin to entertainment, or the 9 to 5 or whatever. But Freud's stance is that is just innate in humans. It's baked in, it's hardwired, and so all we could do is find a way to be less violent about it.
To
Yeah.
channel it some way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think too, like, one of our big mistakes is thinking we're somehow better than animals or plants for even that. If you don't equate all of that, then you can start to build in sort of that ego to where it becomes okay to sacrifice something.
Right.
And even better if it's the other human, right? So, like, for some reason, I was thinking about the Reign of Terror when you get into this notion of collective neuroses, this tyranny of the mob sort of mentality, right?
Yes.
Where if you have enough people believing that it's an okay thing to do, you might even be able to convince the person who is going to be killed that it's okay to do.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up too. I didn't necessarily dive into that because we're running short on time, but the Reign of Terror was really interesting because it came up as one of the contemporary forms of sort of human sacrifice, in that after the French Revolution, basically the proletariat went apeshit and started ritualistically murdering all the aristocracy. And this lasted months on end. And basically, Robespierre said, "Terror is the name of the day," or the word of the letter of the law, or something like that. And so the concept was, we are going to terrorize the aristocracy now that we've kind of taken power from them.
Didn't they end up getting another king anyways after
Yes,
all
of
that?
course they did.
So it's like the killing of Caesar. Like they killed
Right.
Caesar to have like democratic power or whatever, and they end up getting a new Caesar.
Yes, because French politics don't work, and that's why.
Damn.
And they never work well. And but yeah, thank you for bringing that, because that is a great contemporary sort of example. Also, I had a couple others, which were the witch trials. Obviously, we know we've talked about that many times in this podcast, but the witch trials would be considered another example of sort of contemporary human sacrifice, in which and for the reasons that I'm about to explain through Girard's theory. So yeah, and also concepts of like Ayla was talking about, cultist Jonestown, right? In Guyana, 900 people killed themselves. Basically, well, we don't know the circumstances and why they killed themselves, but it is assumed that Jim Jones coerced 900 people to kill themselves, even though we know that there was probably a threat of death by a gunshot anyways. So regardless, I believe that would be another contemporary sort of instance of mass human sacrifice. Sacrifice to a concept that Jim Jones sort of had in his mind. And I don't think a lot of them held, but unfortunately, Jim Jones was the one with the guns. So he was not. Yeah.
Well, sad. They practiced that on the regular. So it was like when they started doing that, there wasn't any reason to assume that this time would be the final time. But the way you die, I think it was laced with arsenic. It's a really violent, painful death.
Yes.
And so people, then they were having parents give it to their kids. And so the parents were like, no, this is terrible. And then that's when, if you tried to escape, you'd get shot.
Yeah.
And so it was like, what's a better death? What's quicker? And I think some people did escape, like they didn't get everybody who ran, but
No, yeah.
but
there were very few people that got to escape. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was terrible. And along similar lines, well, not similar at all. But did you want to talk more about the cult? I is going in a different direction.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just thinking about like sacrificing of a life, and I always thought about this in like ascetic traditions. So that's the idea that you would ascribe to a religious belief that prohibits certain things in your life. You can't do this, you can't do that. And sometimes they're minor things, other times they're big things that definitely redirect the course of the way you live your life. And in some ways, I thought to myself, like, isn't that a sort of sacrifice in of itself, the withholding of certain pursuits or desires or activities, because like the Epicurean kind of contrast would be that you enjoy in the delights, and a lot of times they're in opposition to one another.
Yeah, well, I think that when we're talking about the transition from the literal into the metaphorical, that one of the main advantages of that is that we could then ascribe the sacrifice that we thought was appropriate. And instead of being beholden to the gods and sacrificing our children, we decided to sacrifice our time or our energy or our focus or, whatever. And sacrifice became a metaphorical thing. And therefore, it was a lot easier for humans to have autonomy over what they chose to sacrifice.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah. And one more, the contemporaries, because I didn't really get into it. But Burning Man. Burning Man is a contemporary of the Wicker Man Ceremony. It literally is a Wicker Man ceremony. So it's a pagan druid ceremony, and I believe even in Burning Man they have the temple. I don't know what they call it exactly, but it's the temple that everybody goes and writes their confessions in. And so everybody goes and posts their confessions in the temple, and then at the end of the festival, it's burnt to the ground. And yeah, that's just a concept of effigy. The Wicker Man, after people weren't being burnt inside of it, they were just using the actual wooden man to burn. That becomes the concept of effigy, another modality in which we can metaphorically sacrifice instead of physically sacrifice.
Yep.
Or offering, right? Offering up to God. And so to talk a little bit about the second guy here, Rene Girard, he had an interesting concept that I thought was good. And he talked about human sacrifice, and it's called mimetic desire. And so Rene Girard was a French polymath and historian, and he was a philosopher. And his main contribution to philosophy and in turn to other disciplines was the field of epistemological and ethical studies of desire. And Girard believed that humans' development occurs initially through a process of observational mimicry, where the infant develops desire through a process of learning to copy adult behavior, fundamentally linking acquisition of identity, knowledge, and material wealth to the development of desire to have something others possess. Now, this sounds like a little bit of commie bullshit, but but it is interesting because he says that all conflict, competition, and rivalry therefore originate in mimetic desire or mimetic rivalry, which eventually reaches destructive stages of conflict, both between individuals and social groups, that requires them to blame someone or something in order to diffuse the conflict through the scapegoat mechanism. Unable to assume responsibility or engage in self-reflection to recognize their own part in the conflict, humans individually and cross-tribally unite to diffuse conflict by murdering the king or whoever appears to have the least support in the conflict, and then recognizing when the person has died how much less stress they have. And the unification leads them to eventually think that the deposed king, think of the deposed king as a god or sanctified, or the guilt is ascribed to an innocent third party whose murder permits the creation of a common unifying mythological underlay necessary for the foundation of human culture. So for Girard, religion and mythology were therefore necessary steps in human evolution to control the violence that arises from mimetic rivalry and unequal distribution of desirable things. Religion directed the scapegoat impulse on imaginary concepts such as Satan or demons, or the absence of which would seen in increase human conflict. The absence of which would be seen in increase of human conflict. So I like this concept that humans need a scapegoat, and in order for society to sort of coalesce, something needs to be banded against. And that does seem to be baked into the human experience as well, is that we need the other to fight. And so I think that perhaps the impulse for human sacrifice was also that it codified the community. And I think there is good, there's good evidence to suggest that that was the case, that actually killing people made the community feel closer.
Yeah, because it can reflect on where their individual mistakes were. Right. So they had to create the scapegoat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then does self-reflection end up getting in the way of social cohesion?
I think so, because I think it authors more independence, which is then tends towards less social cohesion.
But then we're getting real close to like tyranny of the mob stuff, though.
Oh yeah,
because I agree. If it is necessary to not reflect on some of the stuff and scapegoat, then it's very easy to take it's no longer a group of individuals, right? It's just like a mob. And then it's very easy to point them like to that scapegoat. So it's weird where you need both. Like, it's okay that, like, I agree that religion, all that stuff, our religion mythology helped us get back to the imagination rather than sacrificing actual physical humans. But at a certain point, self-reflection is the necessary so that we don't repeat that same process, right? Where we don't go back from sacrifice or blaming things, scapegoating Satan or demons, to scapegoating humans again.
Yes, because usually the evidence for the abstract scapegoat doesn't manifest itself, and so multiple attempts at that might yield a more a desire for a more physical manifestation. Yeah, exactly.
And you got to kill something, right?
Yeah, you got to kill something. Yeah. But yeah, to talk about the witch trials, this is that sort of same thing where it's like the lack of self-reflection and knowledge of their own faults turned into this frenzy in which they can only scapegoat other people, and that's like finding the witch. The witch is still around. Things are terrible. The witch is still here. We got to find her. We got to kill her, and that made their community stronger.
Yep, Exchange Act's like a double-edged sword like that, right?
Yeah.
You need social cohesion in order to like run a civilization or have the civilization do stuff without imploding. But too much of it, then you start to get all this scapegoating, tribalism type stuff.
Right. Hyper cohesion. Yeah. And then you just basically create otherness. If it becomes a binary where it's like either you're a part of the in group or you're not, and that's it.
And the whole thing devolves.
Yes.
Into madness.
Into madness.
Not the good kind of madness either.
Not the fun kinds. Yeah. But yeah, that's it for me, guys. Do you guys have anything else you wanted to add?
No, that was really well done, Nick. That was a good survey of sacrifices over the ages, influences, possible reasons, the transition away from it. I feel like I learned. I love these survey topics, because like it helps to anchor your understanding of like other stuff, and just it's just fascinating. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, I tend to find myself pretty fascinated by it too. I think that like the amalgamation of our podcasts, it would seem like each episode is connected to each other in some way, shape, or form, which I think is interesting. All the topics that we've touched relate back to a topic that we've touched before. So it'd be interesting to see if we can build like a web of episodes and connect the dots to see like the tapestry of what we're actually talking about here, because it seems like so many things connect.
So many graphs.
So many graphs.
All the graphs.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. We really appreciate it. We hope that you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to leave us a comment and perhaps a subscription to our YouTube page. It would really help us out. We are always trying to grow and just provide better content for you guys. So if you ever have any input or suggestions, please feel free to comment and we'll take it into consideration. But we very much appreciate you taking the time this evening or anytime you're listening to us. We are just so very touched by your interactions and by your listening. And so thank you. We very much appreciate it. Please go be sure to support our friends and our friends' podcasts. Keelan, I do a podcast with Keelan and Dijon called Screen Time Continuum, where we rate movies, and that is on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8:30 p.m. Keelan's got a podcast by himself. It's called If Numbers Could Talk. You can check that out at Tuesday nights at 8:30 p.m. And then Dijon the Mustard's got his Twitch channel. He's doing really well, Strawberries and Coffee on Twitch. And he does that on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10 p.m. But if you're a purist and just want to hear us talk about the esoteric and the weird, I thank you to Ayla and my thank you to Mike. Thank you guys so much for the wonderful conversation. I always appreciate you guys.
Ooh, and one
And
thing,
yes.
next week, I just want to do a little plug. If you
Mhm.
join us next Monday, we're gonna dip into the strange and mysterious history of the Ouija board.
Oh,
Since
cool.
Halloween is
I'm glad
coming.
that you were able to. Yes, I'm glad you're able to tease that. We want to make sure we're trying to tease the next episode every time. So thank you,
Tease,
Ayla.
tease.
Yes, Ayla
You're
will
welcome.
be Ayla will be doing an episode on the Ouija board next Monday at 8 p.m. So please feel free to join us on that episode. And we always alternate every episode, so each time it's one of us that does the narrating and the sort of hosting. So please be sure to check us out and check out our back catalog. We got almost 70 episodes up, and they are all waiting for you on YouTube at Exofathom. So until next time, Cogmonauts, you stay out there, and we will catch you on the next Exofathom. Good night.
Peace.
Later.